You said you had reviewed the all three segments of the talk we had last week.
Yeah. Well, I suppose the things that I kind of took from it, especially through the kind of second look at it, the review of it, was first of all the kind of contextualizing the idea of non-self within ethical and societal and kind of relational aspects. Because I think I have a tendency, and I think probably a lot of people do, to try and make sense of the Dharma very internally.
Mm-hmm.
So you probably, yeah. And so kind of embedding those ideas within relational contexts, I think is very helpful, actually, for me.
Good. Yes. Contextualize, or let us say, placing human behavior that the Buddha was really big on, and put it into the context of how societies actually operate, depending upon how they use their mind. And that many of them out there have the delusion that they are their personality. And many of those have also the delusion. In fact, I am that. Doesn't have to even be a belief of a religion. That atheists will think that also, having a fixed personality. That in fact, that's what the Buddha was accused of, is what is called annihilationism, which means upon the break of the body, the annihilation of the individual, or the annihilation of, how would it be put in the suttas? The existing being. The annihilation of the existing being, but that's what they accused him of. And you could see naturally it was the eternalists who were accusing him, because he wasn't really accused of being an eternalist. That wouldn't make sense. But he was accused of being this is kind of the ancient way of speaking about atheism. But it's backwards, because it's saying that yes, I exist, but after the death and breakup of the body, that dies too. So this is even a more direct adherence to the personality that we talked about, gives rise to actually cliches that people understand, and that is, he who lives by the sword will die by the sword, destinies and all kinds of things. And it's not just the eternalists that have those kind of belief systems. That actually, whether they believe in God or not, or what kind of God they believe in, it's still the existing self, which is attached to a personality that either doesn't change or changes very slowly.
And this is also the kind of, this is the same, that insight is the freeing from karma, isn't it? Like once you kind of have seen through the notion that there is a constant discrete self, then that constant discrete self can't you free it of your karma, because you are accepting the fact that you are newly born every moment. So how, and if you truly live from that place, then you are truly free from your past, the mind states that precede this moment.
Okay. Now, we can say that this is something like an optical delusion. And one of the examples that I have, I remember once being in the Detroit Zoo, that they had a window on display at an angle. until you started looking closely and moving around and know it was standing right in front of you, but the wood was cut to make it appear like that it was at an angle. Okay. This is actually the kind of thing that we have is an optical deception at a magnificent level of thinking that this personality that's there is me. And so it comes up with all kinds of language like I am angry. All right. Where in fact, a more beautiful way of looking at it is to actually wake up to the anger, to see the anger. And then through the teachings of the Buddha, I see you, anger. Now we're drawn out of it and we are no longer the anger. We can become disassociated from it. If we can do that, then that means that we are in fact not that personality that bore that anger.
It's also the recognition of like cause and effect, isn't it? It's the recognition of
precisely so. What is the cause and what is the effect?
But it's interesting that you're talking about the cliches of he who lives by the sword died by the sword and all of that. I mean, all of those are true if we are not able to let go of those identity views, right? Like,
yes.
And to be completely free, to be that kind of free of karma. We were talking in the other kind of conversation about the kind of mechanisms of the mind that one gets to explore in meditation, and one of those mechanisms that you get to see through its reduction is the way that perception is filtered through the sankhara. So our experiences and our past alter the way we perceive reality. And if we are stuck there, then the way we perceive reality is in line with our past, and we are limited by that personality.
Excellent. Yes, that's exactly right. What you're saying is spot on.
So we get these tastes in meditation, we get these experiences of perception and consciousness that is, you could say, purer, I don't know, freer, and less tied to these grooves of our mind, less tied to our, if you want to use the yogic language, karma, or less tied to sankhara. And in so doing, we realize that it's possible to live and act and engage with reality from a less constrained, tethered place. And then we bring that as an intention into our daily life, and hopefully we get better at it.
That's brilliant. That's very, very good way of saying it.
Yeah.
And that in fact you need to repeat it more and more like that to really get it down solid for yourself. And so it's good that you can bring this out, because this is in fact the heart of the matter. Can you become free of that personality? The answer is yes. But that answer is also conditional. It's not a yes. It's a yes, 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 yes. Because it has to be asked often.
Yeah.
Because there's always that invitation of going back into the old ways of doing things at so many different levels. That in fact, right now, it just so happened, I won't go into great detail, but Willie and his dad are now cooperating together to help each other become individually free from anger. And so the job basically is that if Daddy gets angry at Willie, it's Willie's job to not respond in anger, but to change it into joy and then tickle mentally his dad into going back into a state of joy, and his dad is in for this game. And so I'm interested in seeing how it goes. But that shows the depth of the persistence of individual traits. Now, you were raised in a situation, so your biggest issue is not anger, but you can appreciate that then in some cases it's a big deal that people are habitually getting angry.
I notice anger arise on like a lot. Like that's definitely something I have to work with as well.
Hey, are you admitting to having kids?
Yeah. I mean, to both having children and parents. Yeah.
All right. Well, this seems like a really, really good segue into a sutta, but forgive me if I've already told it to you. But it's sutta number 87 in the Majjhima Nikaya, and it tends to be quite useful. So I say this to students kind of on a regular basis. The title, the name of this sutta is that grief comes from those who are dear. That's the name of the sutta. Basically, it goes like this, that some wanderer happened to by when the Buddha was teaching this to his students. He later got into town and got into a gambling game, possibly 2,500-year-old dice of some sort, because they had bones back then, you know. And while they were discussing this, and the people in the game, the men in the game were saying, "Oh no, I really love my children. I get great joy from my kids." And you know, back and forth like that. And while they were having that talk, a servant of the queen came by, and she heard this, and she already knew about the Buddha, and she knew about the relationship that King Pasenadi had. So she went and told the queen. The queen told the king. They brought the girl back in and says, "Okay, you go and talk to the Buddha about this." Now, this was probably not the first time that kind of instruction had been given. But what we do know is that this woman is now in the suttas to have become a sotapanna merely by going and asking the Buddha questions that the king had sent to her. And so she sent back the answer that was, yes, there is grief coming from those who were dear. And then the end of the sutta is about the king and the queen standing on the balcony of the palace, kind of agreeing with each other that, yes, you are dear to me, and I am dear to you, and we will have grief when one of us dies. And so that's it.
They're not going to give each other some grief in the meantime.
I was about to cover that one too. Yes. That in fact, any time that a son doesn't do what his father wants him to do, they both are in a state of grief. And generally it's the father because he cares the most. But family connections are like that. The family don't do the way that we want them to do.
See, but this is really interesting because
you got kids.
Because I got kids, yeah. Yeah, it's very interesting because I suppose like if you can apply those insights of non-self to family relations, if you can look at your children and not project a self onto them that ought to behave in certain ways and that should be like this and that shouldn't be like this, if you can let that child freely move through their life without you trying to put a kind of prison of this is how things ought to be with you on them, then you are going to spare yourself a significant amount of that grief and spare them a significant amount of that grief, right? I'm not even talking about the grief of separation or death. I'm talking about just
the grief of a misbehaving child.
Yeah, or because this is, we get upset in our relationship with our nearest and dearest because they
Are the ones who are most dear.
yeah. But I feel like just to relate it all to non-self, because it's always like they let us down or I let them down. And if we can have a lot more relaxed ideas about I and they, then and
Yes, precisely so. And it can all be listed under the label of letting go.
yeah. Because that's where Buddhism can be regarded, or the Buddha's teachings are regarded by some people as being kind of how to best put it? People, it's perceived by people who don't practice within the kind of Buddhist traditions that the emphasis on suffering and desire as the cause of suffering is inherently anti-life in somehow somehow.
Yes, via negative or nitty.
Yeah.
The path of releasing and letting go of baggage, as opposed to getting new tools to help you carry more baggage.
Yeah. But the way I choose to see that is it's like understanding the potential for suffering and understanding the mechanisms of suffering through clinging and craving allow, to whatever extent you can realize that is the extent to which there can be ease and joy.
All right. Well, let's look at those words that you're using right now for a moment. Suffering, desire, clinging. Those kind of words are all, let us say, over the top words. And part of that has to do with the fact that the original translations of the word dukkha and its opposite sukha were misunderstood and then mistranslated from a more Christian point of view. That if Buddha is way high up there, then he must be talking about suffering because we've got one on our cross. Okay. And so dukkha does not actually mean suffering. That in fact, suffering itself could be another word that was almost positive, and that is someone who can persevere through something. But yet, what we're really looking at is that suffering hurts. That suffering, we don't like it. Okay, very few of us are proud of being able to get over such things, but I have actually seen a guy take right out in public, take a giant fish hook, run it through a couple of ribs, put a rope on the end of it, throw the rope over a tree, and there he is swinging from that tree, bouncing up and down, literally in joy, being hung by a fish hook through his ribs. But he does it annually, and it's the same hole that he puts the fish hook through. But that's his stick, okay? Now, while he's dangling there, do you think he's in suffering?
Probably not, no.
Okay, if you were hanging there the first time, would you be suffering?
I think so, yeah.
All right, there's your projection right there of suffering. That in fact you don't really know the extent of it. It's something that we do in our imagination, and it's also could be considered grandiose. That mental pain and mental anguish is always bigger than the actual thing. And I've had several examples of that in the sense of broken bones, broken legs, all kinds of stuff. And I recognize that the body will go right after it, will go into a stunned state. And there's many, many examples of that. One of them is I think, in the movie Cleopatra, where they have a boat wreck. And this guy gets the lower leg just whacked right off by this beam that fell on it. But yet he's still getting shoulder help, and he's jumping on one leg while he's getting off the boat. In other words, he's got to have presence of mind. He knows that if he stays there, poor me, I just lost my leg, he's probably going to die. Okay, so the question would be then, when he first immediately understood that he had lost his leg, was he suffering? Or maybe the second thought was, I've got to get out of here, and that replaced the suffering. And so it didn't last very long, and it wasn't such a big deal. Later, when he's free and easy, he isn't free and easy. Now he's thinking about, poor me, I lost my leg. And that he's suffering again. But the real suffering is not from the pain of the loss of the leg. It's the fear of the loss of the use of the leg. And so it's very much still, even though the event has already happened, it's always fear that's the issue. Oh, poor me, what's to become of me? Will I survive? And so the pain itself, people can learn to manage. But what's happened, especially in the United States, is the pharmaceutical companies have sort of bribed the doctors into freely giving out opioids so that people don't have to manage their pain mentally anymore. But back in the old days, let's say really old days, before there were any dentists, and old people would pull out their own teeth, so they're going to get to do it. Was it a big deal for them? Maybe for a few, but others after 32 or 4 or more, you get kind of used to doing it over the years.
I was quite shocked.
So what is suffering?
Yeah.
All right, so sorry about that, but I've gone down a rabbit hole called suffering because you used it. Let's get right to the real words that we need to start thinking about, and that is dissatisfaction. Because we can come out of momentary dissatisfaction just like that, by becoming satisfied. And it's a change of attitude, and it's really quite easy to do. And so suffering looks like that there's a whole lot to it. And desire. But the root of desire is just wanting. And the root of wanting is liking. And the root of liking is the mental image of what we saw or wanted, not the actual thing. Even if it's a piece of art in a museum or a store of art, when we look at it in my house, rather than this is it. And so we identify with it and take it as our own, and therefore it's mine, and that's the clinging part. But you live much of your life not doing that grasping, heavy-duty clinging, but you do a much lighter weight job of it. That in fact, the really heavy stuff you didn't probably have to deal with the way that some people that you've probably even been around. But places on the earth really lay heavy trips on the kids. And so being relatively free of that, that means that you're relatively free from the really heavy stuff that have to do like killing another man because you're jealous of him and this woman, you see. But that happens in some quite human, in fact. Stories abound. Shakespeare's favorite term, or favorite movie. Um, so these feelings that we have uh, are normally the master, and they actually then prove, or that's the personality, that we are literally driven by our feelings.
Mm.
Uh, and that it's always done in a very subtle place, not this big, heavy, suffering place, but at little windows of dissatisfaction.
Mm.
In fact, people who have anxiety often don't know from moment to moment the level of anxiety. Some things are really hard to detect, like blood pressure. Very, very few people can keep a management on their own blood pressure. That's a real skill to be learned. I haven't seen anybody I know of that can do it well. Normally, we need that sphygmometer. But there's a lot of other behavior that's very, very subtle that we can, in fact, see.
Mm.
And that would be the kind that would take us out of our state of satisfaction.
Mm.
Okay, so the practice of being in a state of satisfaction then over time brings the mind together in a unified state so that what used to be Matt, which was a crowd who went this direction and that direction based upon how he feel or what he thought in the moment, now there's a much more unified Matt,
Mm.
settled down, stable, and in a way you could think of as having his sea legs, mental sea legs, so that we
Mm.
can sort of handle the jostles of life and not lose our balance.
Mm.
This is the level of equanimity that we can attain to. But that's almost an accident of the practice of investigation and joy
Mm.
that bring about the stability of being at rest and at peace, then that allows that equanimity. In fact, equanimity is just being in a state of not really willing to get excited about anything.
Mm.
uh, so this whole path has a whole lot to do with how we view the personality and the changes that go through it,
Mm.
that it goes through. And Bhikkhu Buddhadasa has a story that he's put in a document called, the name of it is "What Is and What Is Not the Self
Mm.
According to the Buddha."
Mm.
Now that's the name of the piece, but I have not seen it in print or in English anywhere. But I do have a copy of it. The source I don't know of. It looked like that it was OCR'd from a bad scan or a
Mm.
bad old copy of some document that had been. So I don't know the source of this, but there are some very interesting things that Bhikkhu Buddhadasa is saying about this stuff in this talk that he gave. And one of the things that he mentions is stuff that's in the suttas about there are views of no self that were in vogue in the time of India, but each one of them had a flaw to it.
Mm.
And the main flaw that seemed to be was the idea that I can go on the other side of the river and kill 500 cattle, and then come back to this side of the river and kill 500. And there's no consequence,
Mm.
which is basically the idea that I can get away with it.
Mm.
Okay, so this idea that I can get away with it then is the wrong view. Then the right view would be, oh, I can't get away with it. But then what happens will be that laws, rules, religions, ways of doing things, a society, a government with its regulations and laws, and all of that come into play to be against this old wrong view of I can get away with a resounding, oh no, you can't, we're watching, which is in fact the parent ego state that each one of us have, or the Freud calls it the super ego, and Buddha calls it the Sila Bhatta Paramasa. It's what we thought was the boss, but in fact our wisdom, our frontal cortex, not our list of rules. The one who is awake and can see what's going on. Or another way of saying it is no longer the autopilot. We're not on the rules of autopilot. Now we're actually flying this craft. And sometimes it's fun to do some loop-de-loops. So getting into this talk a bit further with the Buddha, he then tells the story of a man who goes into the forest and he becomes hungry and he's wandering around and he runs across a big fruit tree. And so he eats a lot of the low-hanging fruit and then he gets some more. He takes his shirt off and he fills his whole shirt, making it into a bag full of fruit. And off he goes, chewing along the way. But the bag gets really, really heavy. And just as about the time that it gets so heavy, he actually runs across a stack of gold. So he immediately throws down the stack of fruit, empties his purse, and fills now his sack with gold, which is much heavier than the fruit. And so now he struggles away with all the gold that he can carry. And when he's just about fed up with carrying that, he runs across a collection of jewels and diamonds. And so he drops all of the gold and picks up a handful of the best diamonds and off he goes. And along the way, the smaller diamonds begin to fall out, but then he's got this really nice jewel, this great, big, beautiful thing that he's got. But even though he guards it carefully, still eventually he loses it. Okay, so this is basically the story. And it's actually the story of humanity in the sense of where are you in life? Are you still struggling trying to get enough to eat? Are you, in fact, at the level of trying to maintain your fortune? Because these are class distinctions. But then the jewel or the diamond would be like someone who is at the top of his game or his profession, Heisman Trophy winner, or maybe the prime minister of a country, the very top kind of people would be those that have a diamond. Another one would be a high Dan in karate. All right, so that they're really masters now. This is the idea of a diamond. Others would be professors in universities. They're at the top of their game. Nobel Prize winners. This is the kind of thing that we're talking about. Is that guy's got a diamond and he knows it. Because he's at the top of his game. He's gone through the process. He's gone through the fire that purified that diamond. Okay? The same thing happens within the religious community, and it also happens with monks in the sense that they begin to develop the diamond, especially when they recognize that they're beyond fear and they're beyond anger. They just don't get angry. They're kind of left it behind. And so then that is the time when they form the diamond, but there is still place for conceit.
Mm.
Okay, that the diamond has to be eventually given away, because so long as it's to be precious, there is still that I am.
Mm.
Whatever is holding on to that diamond, we have to eventually give that up if we're going to pass through all of the phases of fearlessness,
Mm.
so that we can happily accept death.
Mm.
Not take death personally is hard to do.
Yeah, but then we might as well try and do that a considerable period of time before we die, so we get to enjoy the fruit of that letting go, right? why
Precisely so.
why
Exactly.
save it for your last breath if you can, if it's possible to do it sooner?
Except that you might have things reversed in the sense of cause and effect. If you can't do that all throughout the day, throughout the year, you're unlikely to be able to do it at that really moment, big one that you need it the most,
Mm.
like death. So we really do need to practice this
Mm.
letting go of how good we are.
Mm.
I mean, all the Dhamma dudes that I know, we're really goody two shoes. We don't cuss and we don't chew and we don't associate with them who do. Have you ever heard that one?
I
Had
have not.
years. Okay, so yeah, there comes a high quality when we have a state of mind that we don't want anything. Then we don't go out doing things because we want things. And so life becomes really easy and there's very little left to do.
Mm.
And so
But
that's, but if we still have the diamond, and now I'm going to start competing, for instance, competing with other meditation teachers. I'm better than you are. See my diamond? See how big my diamond is? I win, you lose. Because what's the point of the diamond anyway if we can't do that?
mm.
And part of it has to do, surprisingly enough, with as we realize the coming together of that unified mind that is as strong as the diamond, that most people don't live up to this standard. But they don't live up to it for the same reasons that you didn't live up to it before. So they are literally in your past, which is right over your shoulder.
Mm.
And for that reason, we don't need that diamond to compare with those who are automatically going to lose. And so if you even get up, so now what we're talking about is working in those high fetters that have to do with basically the word that we would use as a reference point would be the word conceit,
Mm.
or the feeling of I am, or
Mm.
the feeling of accomplishment that has evidence, but the evidence is not a smile and a chuckle. The evidence is the kind of the proof of this magical diamond of having put things together or whatever,
Mm.
that a teacher even will tend to bash other teachers with.
So it's once again to go back to the kind of, I relate this to the idea of the self, and what you're talking about, what Bhikkhu Buddhadasa was saying about a kind of middle way that the Buddha spoke of between self and non-self. In some ways, you have to recognize the idea of or utilize the idea of a self enough to take responsibility for your actions and to lay the causes that will have effects
Mm-hmm.
within this self that are going to be positive, and then at a certain point let go of attachment to that fruit and that result,
Precisely. Yes.
Because I suppose an extreme view of non-self is there's no self. I'm already I'm already enlightened. What's the point of doing? What's the point of practice? What's the point of doing the right thing? What's the point of not doing every desire that comes into? Do you know what I mean? Not.
Yes, except that the answer to that is, what's the point of asking those questions anymore? That sounds like a lot of work, is asking all of those questions about why should I do any work?
Yeah.
So the loss of the diamond is the ability, real compassion, in fact, because this is the last weapon that we lay down, is the feeling I'm better than other people. Because look how hard I tried, and look how much Dhamma I learned, and look how long I was there, and look how long, blah, 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 But that's what we do, almost in a sense of recognizing this grand accomplishment, which is really amazing, beyond where most people ever go. And yet, recognizing that they don't want to know it, and they don't want to know you, especially they don't want to know you because they don't want me to remind them that they're not up to my standards, whatever I'm doing. Okay. So I noticed that a lot when I was actually a monk in public in North Carolina and dealing with Christians and things like that. But I also recognize it even more in depth, being rejected by someone that I wanted to be my friend. And that was like, how dare him not accept me as a friend? I mean, how many people are going to be as friendly as I am? Blah, 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 blah. So that's bringing that diamond out and try to make sense out of things, rather than recognizing, no, we can't control a lot of stuff. It's not really our business. Our business is, can we be sabbai and happy right now, no matter what people think of us? Because you're not going to get everybody to agree on anything anyway. But at some levels, that doesn't matter. But at other levels, in fact, the deeper we go, it winds up, for some reason, being really important. It's almost down to that instinctual level of the herding instinct, or the same instinct that fish go into when they're schooling. We just want to get into the flow of how things are supposed to be, when in fact our wisdom is telling us opposite of that. And so we have to start making that kind of a choice about, are we actually going to follow the truth, or are we going to go along to get along? That happens on a regular basis, probably at your school. But once you begin to understand what we're talking about, this stuff is actually kind of easy to deal with. It's not so hard to deal with. All we have to do is be alert to it, to be awake, to recognize that we don't have to. In fact, the thing to do is to be on alert for herd behavior. That would be a way of doing it. Whenever you see others herding into some, trying to get a consensus about something, that's kind of herding behavior. That my idea is a wonderful idea, but it will be more wonderful if you agree with it. And that comes out of our herding instinct.
But then I suppose if we approach those circumstances with the right attitude, we choose wisely. We don't just reject it from a kind of sense of individualistic rejection of any consensus, but we also don't just go along with it out of a fear of self-obliteration if we stand against the consensus.
So this would be then a middle path.
Mm.
The middle path is don't go along with them, but don't try to dominate them either with your intellect or prove them wrong or show off or any of that diamond bearing business that most of us are really good at. So that we can remain friends. And so that's what conceit then is changed into, is conceit is now being through wisdom modified into friendship. Not in the sense that we're equal to everyone, because we're no longer comparing. There's no up or down or back and forth. The only issue is friendship. With that, we then go an inch deeper and wind up understanding that actually this conceit that so bothers us and makes us into competitors with the people that we could be friends with is driven by anxiety. It's driven by restlessness. And that restlessness is driven by a deep level of dissatisfaction. So basically, what the mechanism is that somehow we don't feel quite right down deep inside, and we know it, and we're looking for a cause or a reason. And guess what? We've just got someone at hand that we can slap this feeling on. Someone that we have competed with or in fact done this to before. We have kind of only a few favorite enemies. And so when this feeling of anxiety or feeling of disgust or whatever comes up, we'll go through our little list of who fits this feeling the most, and we'll pull him off the shelf and blame him for it. This is
Use
the
other people as an excuse for our rubbish feelings.
Right. So actually underneath this conceit is a feeling of not necessary well-being. There's no well-being under that. And so we're looking for well-being. And the answer then is, oh, if I compete with him and win, then I'll feel superior, I'll feel happy, and that. But the real way to win is to win over our own mind, to be able to see those deep feelings and thoughts that get us into a place of competition with one another.
And then to use that insight as a trigger to let go of that impulse. Have a deep breath.
Yes, exactly. Exactly. To keep coming back to the present moment and letting all of that stuff go. But it's good to understand it both from the emotional and also the Dhamma level. That this is exactly the way that in fact, much of what I'm talking about is right there in the sutras about this is conceits, this is restlessness. This is actually, I think, would be 8 and 9 on the 1 to 10 scale that they have. Where anger is number 5 on the scale. All right.
I'm glad that that's a mid-ranking one, because it's so deep that
anger comes out at exactly the same point. In fact, you could say that anger is just a hot-headed way of expressing competition. Because we feel insecure inside. So after we are able to actually see the anger itself and can say, down boy, That's when we can go down under that and see that level of conceit, the level of I am better than you are at this argument, or in a way, there's a term for it. It's called righteous anger. That we get angry because we feel right about something. That's the diamond. We feel really strong about something. And why is that? Why does my clinging matter so much? Well, look how much time and effort that I put in. I mean, I was a real victim to all of that stuff. Where's my prize? So you can see how all of this stuff is wrapped up in personality, and think that we deserve something, rather than merely accepting the fact that you've already won. Because the only person who ever cared about the game that you're playing is you. I told Willie this morning, funny thing, I said that at least now I passed my own test. How does one get to the point of passing one's own test? I mean, up to my own standards. The answer is, well, I took a few questions off the test.
Yeah.
And now I'm up to scratch, up to standard. And basically, the items that come off the list actually are the proof of the diamond. Those are that's the stuff that comes off the list. Can I sit still longer than anybody else? Is one of them.
Also, the things that we want outside external recognition for. It's interesting that these are all potential pitfalls along the way of a path of relinquishment as well, right? Because and
that's the point that I'm making is the better you get at relinquishment, the harder your diamond is. That also needs to be thrown out.
I've wondered recently, and have thought to bring up with you at some point, a question kind of which I think touches on this, which is sort of how to skillfully relate to the concept of, or how to skillfully relate to those fetters and to the idea of awakening. Because on the one hand, the kind of genuine aspiration to awake, to become freer, and to use the kind of models and systems which have been used skillfully is good, right? Like the 7 factors of awakening, for example, are like an incredibly helpful, skillful
set of milestones, actually, if it were.
Sure.
Let us see
similarly, the fetters, like very helpful ways of examining oneself, right? Like in relation to these things. But yet I can see how, and very easy for those things to be another source of wanting and suffering and delusion and pride and all the rest of it.
Because all of them will take us out of our state of satisfaction, and that's really the only goal, is to just be satisfied.
But some of them will help us, like relating to those frameworks.
Right.
Will also help us kind of.
It'll help us make the diamond. It'll make it strong.
Yeah. But it should also, if we're going about it correctly, at every point along the way, it should also be helping us prepare for the letting go of the diamond, right? Like, ideally, we want to be kind of letting it go every...
Yes, exactly. Yes, exactly true. That in fact, if you do enough of the letting go along the way, the diamond is not nearly such a big deal when you let it go.
Mm. And that sort of relates to what we're talking about death, right? If we're letting go every moment, then at the end,
Right,
let go.
precisely.
Yeah.
And so we're using the word in English, everybody understands letting go.
Mm.
But we can also see the conceptualization of that if we let go, then we're no longer clinging, which means we are no longer in it, which means now we're lokatara, we're above the world. This is the
Mm.
super mundane, is the letting go and no longer being attached to it.
Mm.
It also has the quality then of what Bhikkhu Buddhadasa, he had a word that he really liked, and I can see it all over. In fact, now we find a Wat in Seattle that is the Wat's name is Wat Atamayata.
Mm.
And so the Rama is actually a power. And the Atamayata is the Bhikkhu Buddhadasa's word. Hang on. Kumpuri? No. No. Kitty? Kitty! Hang on, I'll be right back. Okay. Lucky. Lucky. It was a food delivery man. I don't know who ordered it, but I have never seen him before, and neither had the dog.
Mm.
So it was, one of those things to pay attention to. Sorry about that.
No. Good.
Uh, so back to where we were, Atam Mayata.
Mm.
The word actually means I'm not going to do anything with Mara. You
Mm.
break it down as the word tam means to do or action. Um, the Thai word for salary is tam nern, and your job is tam nan. Okay, so tam means to work or to do, pay attention to, or fiddle with, or whatever words we want to use. Uh, and is the negative, which means don't or don't work, don't mess with. Mara. Okay, we've already talked about Maya to great lengths.
Mm.
That the magical version is the devil. We can also see it as the world. We can also see it as the hindrances of the mind. And in some cases, we could see it as don't think about or mess with or try to go visit a person because it's already screwed up. And so just leave them. This is the Thai way of conflict avoidance, to where in the Western world we have the concept or conflict resolution.
Mm.
But a much better way, if we can do it with our own minds, is conflict disappearance. That we're not avoiding the conflict, it's just there's really no conflict. Or another one would be of recognizing, well, I'm the one that's been doing the conflict, maybe. And those people over there are just ticked off at me because of all the conflict that I'm up to.
Mm.
And so if I would stop the conflict within my own mind of competing with them or whatever. Okay, so really often the conflict resolution is just forget about it. Conflict disappearance.
Mm.
To where conflict avoidance has the quality of holding a grudge, not
Mm.
ever wanting to go back. And conflict resolution has the quality of open warfare. So, going in that level of conflict, that really the only place that there is any conflict is in my comparing myself to other people. Because we start doing that when we're kids and we get into the habit of it. And the question is, when do we ever come out of it? For many of us, it's not until I get a diamond, not until I know I can win this game. But
Mm.
then now the game becomes kind of boring and I don't want to play it anymore. And so that's part of the path. The other part of the path is the one that you're talking about and that is grinding it down every time you catch it.
Mm.
And in a way, you can do kind of both
Mm.
because it's the analogy of the diamond uh, kind of fails at this point because this is actually a mental
Mm.
situation that we're dealing with, so that you can uh, let us say it's actually part of one's right attitude.
Mm.
The noble attitude is that I can do this even if other people can't. And so that's part of the reason that we do, in fact, want to develop that diamond, is that we've got evidence. But eventually, kind of want to throw it out after it's well used, after it's proven its worthiness, it's no longer needed.
Mm.
So
Kind of like
this is
the raft.
pardon.
Kind of like the raft.
That's the other analogy,
Yeah.
right? As long as we're on the journey, we need the route. But after we get off of the raft, after we've actually crossed the shore, then we don't continue to carry the raft around, nor do we turn it into a shrine.
Mm.
That we leave it for whatever uses that other people can make of it. Uh, Now, I fiddled with that idea in the sense of abandoning the Dhamma altogether. That was what I thought was the raft. Um, but I think that uh, that was not a wise understanding for me at the time. Because now that Bhikkhu Achan Po has put back into the teaching, I can see that I've gotten enormous benefit from coming back and doing the teaching.
Mm.
That has been really, really valuable and so worthwhile. Um, so uh, there's a there is the idea of the raft, but I think that in fact that it's kind of premature when people make too much of a big deal of the Dhamma rather than um, I say kind of letting it become part of the furniture, or
Mm.
it is the furniture. rather than a relic up on a high pedestal. It's just that's the furniture we live in. So that's a kind of a better way of looking at it, that it's not royal or glory or anything. It's no longer the raft that got me over the shore. It's now uh,
Coffee
uh,
table.
a couch to sit on.
Yeah.
And so both of those ideas of either throwing out the diamond or to chip away with it any time that you see it, both of those are valid views, valid ways to look at it. It and it may be that the right way of doing it is to keep chipping away with it and chipping away and chipping away till you get down to the point that there's kind of nothing left but diamond left. And then you recognize, wow, what a big diamond I've still got left. And that too has to be eventually maybe in one chip to throw it out also.
In terms to relate this to something we were talking about earlier, about the idea of dukkha and kanya, or dissatisfaction and wanting.
Tanha, yes, okay.
Tanha, yeah, to use those more kind of down to earth translations. Is then it's using those ideas and using those understandings. The idea is then that if we can relate to life, aware of the fact that we create dissatisfaction through our constant wantings, and if we can, and like our family members, like we were saying about like how, you know, it is our family and our nearest and dearest that will cause us grief. That's not saying don't have loved ones. That's not saying don't bond with the world. It's saying recognize that within your relationship to the world,
There are several
craving.
ways that we can take that.
Say
One
again.
of there are several ways that we can take that.
Yeah.
One of the ways we can take that is that is to say, if grief comes from those who are dear, then we should be careful.
Mm.
Okay.
To not
Another
bring
one
too
is,
much
yeah, don't care too much.
want and self to those relationships and to those areas.
Right. Exactly. And one way of looking at that is that Kilbran had the analogy that your child is like an arrow, that
Mm.
once the arrow is launched, you don't have any control over it anymore. And so even little kids, as you know, each one of them already has his own personality. And if you don't give him credit for his own being, you'll hear about it. Everyone already has that kind of self-protection mode built in for us to not. Now that you know that, that means that you have the ability to, let us say, bring about better states of mind with them by being happy and joyful and game playing and whatnot like that. You invite them to also be in that kind of state.
So by approaching it with less craving for things to be a certain way, through approaching it with a kind of more fluidity, right, and like less sense of like, you are my child or you are my parent. If we approach it with more fluidity, if we approach it with some lightness, and if we approach it with some playfulness, then we are in the dance of it, and we're not trying to make it be a certain way, because that's where the suffering comes.
That's exactly right. But eventually we're going to lose it and have to deal with the loss of it. And let us go ahead and compare the difference between doing this in advance and loosening of the bond versus someone who's really tight with it. And yet when we lose it, both of them can come to the conclusion of, yes, the Buddha was right. There is suffering or there is grief in those who are dear, and that gives both a kind of justification for that grief. And also with the recognition of it, it shortens it quite a bit.
I mean, it's like
So being prepared for it, if you know that every one of your kids is going to give you grief, then when they do, you can say, I see you, Myra. And there comes back that term atamayata, of not doing the things that are associated with hindrances, bad feelings, all of that kind of stuff. So
but
don't do that anymore.
But that doesn't mean I'm sort of interpreting that like in my life, where I kind of see that it doesn't mean not engaging with the world. It doesn't mean not having children. It doesn't mean not bringing a kind of willingness to play and love in the world. It means having an awareness that if you bring too much craving to that play and love, if you bring too much self into those relationships, you will suffer. But to the extent that you can play and love lightly and selflessly.
Precisely, exactly correct. This is the lesson. So now let's do one last thing, and let's go to the word love again, because you can see that if you love someone, then you hold them dear, and therefore something's going to happen, and you're going to have grief. So grief comes from those that we love. If we love them in a way that will cause grief, by controlling them or by thinking that they're permanent or that they owe you something or all of that kind of stuff. Okay. Thinking that we can't live without them. So this is the whole thing about the love is love that's altruistic means that I can hold that child dear, but I can manage it when that child rebels or goes off and does what he wants to do or whatever, because I'm kind of ready for it. In a way, we've kind of chipped away at that diamond. And so now we understand the Buddha story a bit more, that yes, we do, through skill development, come to the understanding that we are in fact becoming noble, but that nobility is not a bludgeon to beat up other people who don't have that, because that's where we came from, that they are just not as far along. And so we gain that kind of compassion. But it sometimes is hard. I mean, here we are, we've been practicing the Dhamma all of this time, and now that I know that I'm really good at it, I want other people to know too, even if I have to rub their face in it. And so we have to kind of get over that. That's that diamond. So while we're developing the lion or the right attitude of being the winner, we have to also recognize that once we have won, it's time to stop competing with all of those other people who haven't won yet in their own mind. So that's kind of like the last of the self that goes. Starts with the understanding of personality view. I am not my past. I am not who I thought I was. And so we begin with personality view, but ultimately we wind up at that level where we are free from comparing ourselves to others, then we're willing to be friends with everyone because there's nothing to fear. So long as I'm competing, then I have the fear that I might lose. But if I give up competition altogether, then there's nothing to lose. So this makes a lot of sense, these fetters that the Buddha is talking about. To be able to come out of that conceit, which has the grounding in agitation. And that grounding of agitation comes from fear, the fear of loss. But when we feel completely secure, then we don't need to compete anymore, or in fact, in that moment. So in that regard, you're not the daddy, you're one of the kids. In fact, that would be something that you could do is that you play a game with them, and one of them is elected for an hour to be daddy.
That sounds fun.
And then another one for 1 hour will be daddy. And let's see where that goes. So for 3 hours, you don't have to be daddy.
Sounds relaxing. I like it.
Well, that's taking one out of one's personality view for sure. And that might be something really useful for the kids to learn. That sounds good. Tell me about what happened with that next time you call.
Sounds good.
Okay, so I think that we beat the self half to death.
Yeah, if we hadn't done it already earlier on in the week, it's definitely done for now.
Yeah.
All right.
Anything left?
Dhammarato, thank you very much.
Okay.
Thank you.
We'll see.
All right. Be well, and we'll speak soon.
Pardon?
Be well. We'll
okay.
catch up soon.
See you.
Bye.